Welcome to Bradford Literature Festival event uh, discussing the wonderful film Where Are All the White Voices? The producers and directors and writers, the creators are here, Kavita Bhanot and Ayesha Manazir Siddiqi, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with them. I am Kairani Baroka. I'm going to go by Oka in this conversation. I'm an Indonesian woman with red lipstick and mismatched silver and black earrings and a black and white shirt against a wall, a white wall. I'm going to introduce firstly the bios of our wonderful speakers, Kavita and Aisha. So Aisha Manazir Siddiqi has published reviews, essays, short stories, poetry, and translations. Her plays and monologues have been staged widely, and she's also written for radio. She's currently contributing editor for a forthcoming podcast by the New York Times. Aisha is from Karachi and lives in London. Welcome, Aisha.
Thank you.
Kavita Bhanot is an ECR Leverhulme Fellow at Leicester University. She is editor of several anthologies, and her fiction, nonfiction, and academic work has been published and broadcast widely, including the landmark essay Decolonise, Not Diversify, and her Tedx Talk. She initiated and co-organized the Literature Must Fall Festival in Birmingham 2019. Welcome, Kavita.
Thank you.
So, firstly, to both of you, congratulations and thank you for making this wonderfully radical, hilarious, and painfully truthful film, I imagine. How did this creation come about for the two of you?
Shall I start?
Sure.
So I'm sitting with white lines behind me, and I have long black hair and kind of vaguely reddish pinkish lipstick, and a nose ring as well, and earrings. So the film came about from a script that we both wrote. You mentioned, Oka, festival Literature Must Fall in 2019. And so we were organizing this festival, and we had this idea when we were organizing the festival to put on a diversity panel that reverses the gaze to really highlight the things that get normalized and are really quite painful and often feel abusive, but we just put up with it, and sometimes we don't even notice it because it's so normalized. So we wanted to highlight all of that. We wanted to do it in a way that people didn't necessarily know what was going on. So it worked really well as a live panel. It was a crazy process because in the middle of organizing this amazing all-day festival, we wrote the script within the last couple of weeks and found actors literally, a few days before. And I think a lot of people thought, what on earth are you doing? But it ended up working really well. I don't know if Ayesha wants to say a little bit, and then also about the film as well.
Yeah, so I'm Ayesha, as Oka said. I am a Pakistani woman, and I have long hair as well and a fringe and red lipstick, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt. So yes, as Kavita was saying, the first time we showed the film was at the festival, and it was quite funny because it's called Where Are All the White Voices? So it was about this upside down world where you're kind of talking about there's like the tokenistic figure of the marginalized and so on, but when you flip it, it just suddenly the absurdity is highlighted, and suddenly it seems like things that are just normalized, suddenly you can tell how strange they are. And I guess the other idea was this: it was also, I think, a kind of internal exploration, because both of us work in literature, and it was like, how do we survive and how do we manage in this place, and how do we see past the subtleties, how do we not get drawn in? And so it felt like it was also sort of like like a study in order to understand how these things happen that can just pass you by if you don't stop and kind of grab it and be like, wait, there's something odd here. So, and then I guess the other thing that we had in mind was like, either you laugh or you cry, you know? So this kind of parodic thing makes it, allows you a different sort of resistance, I think.
Yeah, that really comes across. And so, am I right in thinking that all of the dialogue in this film comes from experiences you yourselves have had or have witnessed?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so. I mean, would you say some of it is stretched, Kavita, or like, would you say? I
You
feel
know
like
what?
it's stuff we've seen.
It's kind of funny because a lot of it is literal, like literally things that I think some of it came from my academic research of reading and writing about authors. So I feel like people may think this is so bizarre and absurd, but it's actually things that people say all the time. Some of it came from experiences just within the few months before the script was written. And I feel like even while writing the script, it was like pulling, things that were kind of happening. It's really every day. And I think that's what we really wanted to highlight. I just wanted to add that so it was actually a performance at the festival. And I do think it worked really well as a performance because it's kind of in the middle of all these other panels. And so you've just got another panel that looks like, a regular panel. And then the questions are coming from the audience, which I think adds to this, feeling of kind of being immersed in it. So we were actually going to continue with that script and perform it after that, but COVID happened, and we kept talking about, we want to do something with it, but circumstances didn't allow it. So we kind of discussed it for a long time, and then decided as an experiment to turn it into a Zoom conversation, which has its own limitations, but we thought it's just a good way of putting it out there and doing something with the idea.
Yeah, and I think Zoom, as you say, is a very particular format, right? But I love the fact that, for instance, you were able to incorporate things like the host literally kicking out one of the participants, which I can imagine didn't necessarily happen in the live performance.
Yeah, I think this was the advantage. Like, we were able to play with the form a little bit and add things like that. We were able to play with people's backdrops, where everyone had a specific backdrop to match like what they were like. And then the thing about kicking out, the interesting thing is also one of the characters, Katie, wasn't in the original play. So when we staged it, Katie wasn't there. And so we also had the opportunity to rewrite and to think about. So we had this George figure who kind of represented this very, the sort of marginalized writer who's very keen to integrate and, very keen to kind of appease the system. And then we thought today, like also kind of addressing today, like talking about the millennial character and how that person too, this person who seems to represent change and, radicalism or whatever, how they can also so easily become co-opted. So we rewrote, and it felt like we were able to add some more nuance, which felt good.
Yeah, for sure. And I was wondering, what the response has been so far, if anything has surprised you in terms of what people have been saying, or from various parts of the industry, or even the casual viewer.
I don't know. I mean, it's been really nice to hear that it's moved people and that people recognize the tropes. But even with the response, I guess it's a complicated. So again, it becomes about why did we make the film and how do we sort of embody our practice. And sometimes what I feel is like whatever you put out there, it's always quite terrifying. And I don't know if this will work. This is my thing at the moment, but what I'm feeling is like both sort of negative and positive feedback to approach those things with complete like equanimity, as in the work is the work, and to know the deeper meaning behind the work and to not get too caught up in the response. That's my current kind of and that might also be because of my personality, because I think I can be quite sensitive, and something in me is just like, the right way to be is to not be swayed either way by the positive or the negative.
Kavita, are you similar?
I think so. I mean, first of all, there was I think that, I mean, both Ayesha and I have a long-term friendship and working relationship. And so we're constantly talking about the fact that there's often things that you do and you write, and I think we both feel often that we sit on those things, and there was a point that we thought we need to start putting things out there, and it doesn't, sometimes it feels like the time is not right, perhaps that, you know, this is not perhaps something that, you know, is going to be, sometimes things are picked up and sometimes they're not, but at the same time it's so important to mark the journey. And I think we have talked about the fact that we don't necessarily do that, and you do work and then you've actually outgrown it, because I personally, I feel like I'm so much more invested in the process of what I'm doing and in the work I do. I feel like whether it's creative writing or critical writing, the kind of journey that I go on in my thinking or in, you know, emotionally kind of untangling things. But the problem that happens is that you're going on that journey, but there's nothing in the world to kind of, you know, mark that journey. And I do think that you can outgrow things. And because of all the ideas of Literature Must Fall, which is what, you know, we've put this out under, there is also a sense that, you know, of being open to critique and to the limitations as well of what we do. But that shouldn't stop you from putting things out in the world. And, you know, hopefully if it speaks to people, that's great. And if it doesn't, that's okay as well, because it's just important to share your journey. So I guess that's echoing what Ayesha has also been saying.
I'm in awe of the emotional maturity of hashtag goals. I was wondering if actually you both could speak about those ideas of it within Literature Must Fall and sort of explain them maybe to audience members who might not be so familiar.
Yeah, shall I start, Ayesha?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the ideas around Literature Must Fall are, we hope, going a little bit deeper. I think we sometimes get not frustrated, but it feels like there's a binary that's often set up between the kind of our ideas around diversity in literature, and maybe those who might oppose that or challenge that. And some of our thinking, or the thinking of Literature Must Fall, is that diversity often becomes a form of inclusion, and the structures remain the same. And it's just about having a seat on the table and just sharing that space, which leaves you not really having power. But thinking about literature a bit more deeply, also to really challenge, I guess, the colonial attitudes around literature, not just colonial attitudes, but probably attitudes that exist in every society, often around literature, whether it comes from whiteness or not, is to really question what we assume about literature and the way in which we elevate literature, and we think that literature somehow, I mean, some of the class bias that also comes from thinking that reading makes you a better person, that everybody should read, and the kind of do-gooding intentions of, you know, let's get more people to read more books, which I think is the dominant thing in diversity, including, you know, the need for more people to write more books. And I guess for me, the thinking for a long time, which comes from my critical work as well, is that, and the more I read, the more strongly I feel it, that actually when I read literature, I think a lot of those hierarchies, prejudices are there in the literature. And I know this is something, Oka, you've also written about in so many ways as well. Those layers just go on and on and on. And so what kind of deception is it to think that we just need to write more literature and we just need to get more people to read, because actually those, you know, those kind of power dynamics that are in literature are probably more influential than, you know, other forms of kind of discourse, people reading. literature, thinking that this is, pure and this is the imagination and this is somehow good for them. It's going to seep into you more. It feels like it's a very different framework, and I have to admit, feels like there's a lot of resistance and disinterest, because who's going to benefit? What is the advantage of anyone? Like, it's not going to sell more books necessarily. It's not going to help writers to feel better about all the hard work and, the pain and the lack of money. So it does feel sometimes like it's quite hard to, think about how to get this shift across, but we do think it's really important.
I think honestly that stance is one of the most radical and wonderful initiatives that I've seen in UK literature. And I wondered, maybe Ayesha, you can speak a little bit about this, how you position yourselves as writers and as members of the literary community, right, whatever that means, with these really nuanced and radical anti-colonial ideas, but still participating within the system. I'm really curious about how you position yourselves.
I mean, I feel like we are not exempt at all from these supremacies that we're talking about that exist within literature. These supremacies very much exist within us. And so as you start disentangling them, you're confronted with them within. And maybe that's in fact where the journey should start. And how do you look at yourself? How do you look at yourself when your own supremacies are revealed to you? And are you able to look that in the face and make the difficult journey of undoing them? It's it's not easy, and it's very, very necessary. And so I think this work isn't necessarily about kind of pointing fingers or like exceptionalizing, but in fact saying that the system that we are within is a supremacist system. And so whatever we produce as well, including this film, no doubt, contains that. It is made in this world, it is made by people, and it contains that. And that is something that we need to hold and something we need to work on and heal from collectively. And so I think that's basically the journey. Some of the things that we've done at Litmus Fall is we have a reading group, a book group, where we take novels, both contemporary and classic, and just talk about them from our. So it's a women of color reading group, and we talk about them from our perspective and reread them. And I suppose even with our own writing, I mean, the hope is that we're approaching our own work and our own beings themselves, because we're not outside of the work, it all becomes one, right? That we're approaching it with that same, I mean, this is not kind of like a self-berating sort of thing, it is a compassionate thing. But yeah, like really approaching our work with that. But also, I think what Kavita was saying earlier about this importance and this struggle that we've had in marking our milestones has potentially been because, you can become so self-critical that it becomes difficult to put work out there. So also being kind of forgiving and compassionate, but at the same time holding yourself to account. I think that's where it begins. It isn't easy, but you do your best, and then you learn, and then hopefully, inshallah, you do a bit better. So it kind of, I think it works like that.
That's such a wonderful sentiment. And actually, speaking about supremacisms and how we internalize them, I wondered if you could both speak a little to the characters of Katie and George as sort of the only non-melanated people in the film, and sort of juxtaposing how you conceived of each character and how they operate within this literature world.
Yeah.
Shall I go ahead, Ayesha, or would you like to?
Sure. Go ahead.
So I touched on it earlier. I think in the creation of George, I think he did start off in some ways being formed from some of the research I had done on British Asian writers. So because that's what my PhD research was on. So a lot of it was, his character came from really kind of studying closely the literature, the writers, and it does it did feel at the time that in some ways he represents a kind of earlier period, which is just a few years ago. And I'm not saying that any of that, it doesn't continue to exist, but I do think there's been a shift when it comes to conversations and including around literature. So the character of George is somebody who does want to fit in, and it's that kind of that period until a few years ago, which was about in a way marketing your so-called otherness or your identity, but also separating yourself from it. And that's what was required of us, that we needed to package ourselves through that identity, but at the same time we needed to show that that was the that applied to the family or community that we had access to, but we ourselves, as an individual, like you are separate and different. And then this idea of being normal equals being white. So often that character who's kind of or narrator, which actually is so common, but just unpacking it like this, it becomes clear in films and literature, who's almost been dropped like an alien into this family and is constantly looking at everything like, who are these weird people and what are these weird things they do, and all they want, they basically escape and enter kind of normal middle class white liberal society. So that's what George represented, and of course the idea of marrying a white woman. Again, it has been so normal, but these things have been really questioned on the margins for many years. But I think in the last few years, that's kind of entered into the mainstream a little bit, and there has been a bit of a shift. And Katie represents some of the problems that come with us thinking, oh, that's kind of changed, but and now everything's better. But I think just in some ways Katie is a really critical and really awesome character, because she's outspoken and brave, and a lot of the things that I think me and Ayesha would also admire about young people today, with the critical kind of perspectives that in some ways have they've absorbed, or they're able to see. But then I think we also through her wanted to question some of the kind of blocks or limitations of that, and in some ways how that can also be a different kind of white gaze, which can end up fetishizing your kind of culture or your identity in the name of celebrating, as opposed to that what George was doing. And I just want to kind of really highlight the poster behind Katie, We Were Once Queens, because I think the absurdity of having Queen Elizabeth in that poster and can just remind us of how actually that is often what we do. We kind of, in the name of like being proud of our culture, we want to kind of talk about how we were all kings and queens, not realizing this is still a kind of power structure that we want to uphold.
Elevating empire in a different way, for sure. And I love that poster, by the way. It was hilarious. Ayesha, do you want to add anything?
I guess what I would say is that I feel like both these positions, both Katie and George's positions, are very easy positions to fall into. Like when you're both Kavita and I think Alka as well, we're writers, and you see this happen again and again. So with the George character, you're suddenly in this. As soon as you enter the literary establishment, it's just so white. And so there is this pressure, especially back in the day, of like, oh, okay, I need to fit in, I need to conform. This kind of idea of wanting to be liked. And now today, when there's all these movements where people are starting to reclaim parts of themselves, although like in some ways that has lessened and given birth to a lot more sort of Katie-ish characters, but you find that also as soon as it comes to the forefront, that becomes the thing. So it becomes like, oh yeah, like show us how radical you are, and and then that becomes that can also become performative, and again it becomes a strange desire to please, and you're pleasing by saying like I don't know if we're allowed, but F you or whatever, that becomes a new way to please. So it's also, I mean, Katie and George were the most fun characters for me to kind of go into, because it's like, then you start thinking, what are the alternatives? And how, I mean, that was going back to your original question of like, how do you, like, what is the absurdity of trying to like fight from within? Like, how do you not become a Katie or a George, you know? And so those two characters also help us, I think, to think like, are there alternatives? Is the alternative like creating our own spaces, you know? Just not, because the minute that you kind of hit that mainstream, you're going to like try and appease it on some level. And so then do we create our own system? But then it becomes a question of the supremacies that exist within our own, you know? So it's just like, it's an endless journey. But I think the fun of it is to kind of really like go deep and think about what this means and how things that seem a certain way might be coming from somewhere else and things like that. But yeah, I guess so I do also feel like both George and Katie are kind of in a system where it's very hard to know what else to do, you know? And I know parts of myself are George and parts of myself are Katie, so it's kind of navigating all of that, I would say.
Yeah, it's really difficult to navigate. I agree, and I think um, one question that I wanted to ask both of you as well is I love I just love the parodies of each character and what everything they represent. But I wanted to ask, you know, what is your opinion of allyship within this industry, and whether or not you think there is, you know, there are better ways of being an ally than what is portrayed, and sort of figuring out who to trust almost within this.
Yeah. I mean, allyship is so complicated, right? One of the things that we explore in the film itself is, first of all, this kind of competitive thing that comes up. It's as if we feel that there are such few spots, and like, oh, these are the POC spots or whatever, and so it becomes this weird thing, or it's or sometimes attempts at allyship can become problematic. So for instance, you see the sort of liberal white industry of like trying to bring, I mean, in many ways, we can end up recreating things in the way that the film does. So this idea of the diversity panel and this kind of tokenistic marginalized person, actually, like, it's very possible that the intentions aren't always evil. You know, the intention might very well be allyship and solidarity and even like a kind of like repentance or something, you know, but it goes wrong. So, I mean, one of the things that I think is maybe allyship involves literally giving the other person the pen, the person who doesn't, rather than being like, oh, you know, come into the, I mean, we have to think hard about what solidarity and allyship looks like. It's definitely not easy.
Yeah, Kavita, do you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems becomes the forms and the kind of, you know, the structures are in place, and even if we try to do things differently, we've inherited certain forms and certain ways of doing things. So we, you know, even if we, for example, we create a panel which is not a diversity panel, but we can end up, you know, recreating some of these things, the form of a panel at all, or the form of a book, and the language and the narrative and every aspect of what we've absorbed from the world. So the intention for this film and for a lot of the work that we do is to highlight things in order to just think really deeply about them, in order to kind of rebuild and think about how to do things differently. But going back to your question of allyship, I think one of the things where, as Ayesha said, we're talking about and bringing up is the kind of well-intentioned or kind of liberal approaches, which in some ways we you know, there are people who want to help and have those good intentions, but we want to think a bit more deeply about, for example, the psychological impact on us of being on the receiving end of those intentions, and the ways in which they can take our power away from us or make us feel powerless or grateful. You know, things like mentoring schemes and, you know, this kind of, you know, these ways of, making space and helping and funding, and it constantly means that you're down there. And that power dynamic remains, and it also makes us feel that we should censor not just what we do, but our thinking as well. I think that's one of the biggest problems. I think the space to be able to really push our thinking is, I think, one of the hardest things when we're kind of in the structure. And my thinking is in terms of the way that in recent years, it felt to me as if there was more space earlier to really push the thinking in a way, because we were ignored. And it's felt like in the last few years, there has been this shift. And now it's not so much a feeling of being ignored, but there's incentives everywhere. And there's, to write books and speak and, get money, which we all need, and we need to earn money. But it feels as if what that's actually done in a way is, I personally feel that there was a collective thinking and a journey which was happening in the margins. And it's felt that as this has been recognized in the mainstream, and it's so hard to, we need that support as well. But I think we've stopped thinking as much, perhaps, or pushing our thinking as much as we could. So yeah, there are limits to that.
Thank you. On that note, I want to thank both of you so much for creating the film and for being here today and speaking so eloquently and radically on these issues that we all need to be thinking and feeling about. So thank you, Kavita Bhanot and Ayesha Manazir Siddiqi.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's great to talk to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today's discussion is called Where Are All the White Voices? And I'm joined here by an illustrious panel of writers and academics. Welcome all, and thanks for coming. Now, before we begin, I'll quickly introduce myself. As many of you may know, I'm Jonathan Harris, Chief Executive of the Diversity and Arts Funding Trust, DAFT, and we have collaborated here with We All Need Diversity, WAND, to bring you this urgent event. Now, please do tweet about the event under hashtag Where Are All the White Voices or hashtag Daft Voices. So let's begin. I'll start with George Sanderson, a promising emerging writer who has been writing for, how long have you been writing for now, George?
15 years now.
15 years, wow. Now, George was born to Anglo-Saxon parents who owned a dairy farm in rural Suffolk. After an incredibly lucky set of circumstances, he ended up writing a novel at the age of only 23. Thanks for joining us, George.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Next, we have Bilal Anzari, who is nothing less than a powerhouse. Bilal is the founder and director of Cup of Tea, where he works with young white people, giving them access to platforms that they have been denied. Thank you for making time for us, Bilal.
My pleasure.
Then we have Professor Ella Savenso, Professor of Creative Writing and Literature at Oxford University and author of the definitive history to white literature over the last 100 years, White Words, Writing Back from the Margins. Ella recently announced the Write Back Scholarship Programme, especially for impoverished non-melanated people in the UK. How has that been going, Ella?
Well, things are moving slowly, but change will come. I strongly believe, firmly believe, in fact, that everyone has a voice.
Of course, and we must return to that. But for now, moving on, we're very privileged to have with us Nikki Miller. She needs no introduction. We're lucky to catch her. She's a very busy lady. And Nikki is the author of 4 novels, and her latest, The Lady in the Attic, has received widespread acclaim and won several prizes, including the Looker. It's been celebrated for, amongst many things, its inclusion of a significant Caucasian character. Welcome, Nikki. It's great to see you again, looking lovely as always. The last time we met was at the Looker Prize after party. I imagine life has changed a bit for you since then.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you for sending these lovely flowers. Yes, my life has changed a bit, but luckily I've got friends and families around me who keeps me grounded.
Well, we're happy to have you here on the ground with us. And last but not least, our youngest speaker today, Katie Thompson. Now, Katie's first collection of Insta poetry, We Were Once Queens, was published, in fact, by Cup of Tea. It was a bestseller. Now, Katie has over 100,000 followers on Instagram, and people say she's been breaking new ground with the representation of diverse voices.
Thank you for inviting me, Jonathan. I'm chuffed to be here.
And we're chuffed to have you. And you're creating a lot of excitement already. Twitter is a buzz, but let's start with Bilal. In a sense, the man behind creating the phenomenon that is Katie Thompson. Tell us a bit about the work you do, Bilal.
Well, at Cup of Tea, we mentor young beach writers, giving them the support and encouragement they so desperately need.
Now, Beach, of course, stands for British, European, American, Australian, Caucasian habitants.
Yes, it's a mouthful, but it's just about making it easier to monitor diversity. As for Katie, we are so proud of her. We came across her on Instagram, and seeing how popular she is, we knew we had a ready-made audience to tap into.
And you also produce plays, right?
We do. Our plays are based on interviews from members of the beach community. We champion their rights, and we believe the way forward is for their stories to be told in their words by us.
You were successful, weren't you, in obtaining the Mughal Court grant last year for the important work that you do?
Yes, and thanks for all your support with that, Jonathan. We're very lucky that in this time of cutbacks, DARF recognises the value of our work.
My wife and I went to see your last play, published, and thoroughly enjoyed it.
We were floored by the positive reception to that one. It was lucky, of course, that White Lives Matter took off just around the same time after the murder of Philip Green.
Published, as many of you listening might know, centres around white people in their own habitat.
Yes, exactly. You see, the pub is usually seen through such a racist lens. We don't normally go into those places, imagining all kinds of seedy, violent, terrible things happening there. But if you actually go into a pub, you can see that it's just white people talking about their families, drinking alcohol, and eating some, it has to be said, very delicious food. I was fortunate enough to be writer in residence at the Prince of Wales. Every day for 6 months, we went there, we interviewed them and observed them. We watched football matches, listened to live music. They have this tradition of tribute bands, which is quite entertaining. Of course, we had some trepidation entering the space, the stories you hear and all, but there was no hostility, only curiosity. And hopefully the play shows that pubs aren't the scary places we all imagine them to be. They're magical, colourful places, teeming with drama and stories. In fact, did you know that pub is short for public house? Their culture is one of peace, actually.
See, I was surprised to find the play was actually quite funny.
They're funny people. You wouldn't know it from the news media, but they're very good at jokes. And by the way, we had a good number of white people in the audience too, although we're still working on outreach to increase those numbers.
It makes economic sense as well, doesn't it, to tell these stories? The white population is only growing in this country after all. It's becoming more and more obvious that connecting with diverse audiences is necessary for the survival of the arts.
Precisely. If we carry on ignoring them, we're missing out on a crucial demographic.
Enter George. Now, George, you've been very successful, haven't you, in giving a voice to diverse communities, drawing on your personal experiences. But you weren't always so interested in reading and writing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Firstly, though, can I just say I'm really happy to be here, just part of such an illustrious panel. I'd never have imagined that one day I'd be on the same panel with all of you. It's great.
You're very welcome.
So to answer your question, no, I hadn't always been interested in books, but when I discovered them, it was a revelation. Books, they're not very common where I come from, unfortunately. There's not much culture in general. Most people in our communities, they live in very isolated enclaves. They tend to speak just to each other. They play golf and bingo, hang around in pubs. They listen to quite this obscure strange music. Ed Sheeran and Coldplay. There's just not really an interest in integrating into wider society. Me, I was always a bit different. My friends and family, they used to call me a mince pie when I was growing up. Quite a
I'm sorry, a what?
A mince pie. Yeah, you know, pale on the outside, brown on the inside. Not come across that? That's well, I'm afraid that's what they call you in non-melanated communities when you're not a typical white person, when you want more from life. You see, I wanted to get out. I wanted to see the wider world. I wanted to fall in love. But my parents didn't understand me. They didn't get that. They wanted me to settle down with a nice traditional white girl and take over the dairy farm. That was their idea.
And now have they let go of their wish to get you married off to a white girl?
Well, I'm afraid they don't have a choice. I was fortunate enough to meet the girl of my dreams at a conference a couple of years ago, Amara. She's tuning in now from the other room, in fact. I was ready to fight everyone to be with her. She just got me in a way that my own community never could, never did. And she just helped me let go of their thinking and really find my own way.
Oh, that's a very touching story. Thank you, George. Now we'll come back to you, but for now, Professor Ella Cervenzo, you're the Director of Literature and Creative Writing at Shoxford, where more and more people are speaking of a diversity problem.
Yes, Jonathan, as we know, the representation of minorities in academia in general is quite appalling. And we at Shoxford were at the forefront of addressing this issue.
Now, why do you think such few beach people go to university, especially to places like Shoxford?
The reasons are complex, Jonathan. You know, first of all, there are barriers, of course, within their own communities. They attach all sorts of stigmas to higher education based on perhaps local traditions and customs. And then, as George said, you know, they have a lack of a reading culture. Now, if you don't have these basic skills, if your parents don't have books around the house, if you've never even heard of, say, Ibn Incha or Zora Neale Hurston, what chance do you have? They often prefer to move in more vocational directions. You know, they're practical people, you know. They have to be. What use is a university degree in, say, a microbrewery or an artisan coffee shop? And finally, of course, there's a lack of knowledge around how to apply and so on, with confidence even. We're taking all this very seriously at the university.
How are you tackling these challenges?
Well, one of the ways, Jonathan, is through our scholarship programme, Fighting Back. Now, there's absolutely no reason, Jonathan, why a young white person with education and training can't achieve just as much as any normal person. And so we take these children and we teach them, you know, the building blocks of what has made up great literature over the centuries. And they come out, I've seen this with my own eyes, they come out with the confidence and skills to really make a mark. And this is what I meant when I said, Jonathan, everyone has a voice.
That's amazing. But for some people, it's just not enough, is it? We've seen recently in the media that students have been campaigning to decolonize university curriculums, demanding more books by white writers, more white teachers.
I think it's wonderful, Jonathan, that young white people these days are so passionate. But change is not going to happen overnight. I mean, we've been invited here by WAND, who are doing an amazing job. There's no magic wand that's going to bring about change just like that. We're talking about centuries of catching up. I mean, do these white lecturers, do they even exist? Are these books by white writers even out there?
Literature is out there. Young people like me are writing and publishing books. All this be patient and change will happen slowly isn't going to work anymore.
I understand, darling. I do. But we can't lose sight of quality over pleasing people. I mean, there's a reason why we're still teaching the classics. Students need to develop a solid foundation before they broaden their horizons to include white literature as well.
Not forgetting the existing lecturers. What would happen to their jobs?
Precisely, Jonathan. I mean, many of our lecturers at Oxford come from a long line of thinkers and scholars who've dedicated their lives to the protection of knowledge.
Now, when the students call for radical change, what do you think they want? Do they even know? Or do they just want to burn the place up, burn down all of the universities?
Of course they know what they want.
We'll come to you shortly, Keighley. Let's have a respectful discussion. Let's wait for our turn and let's give others a chance to speak, right? Professor Spencer.
I believe, Jonathan, that more and more there is a breakdown of trust. These young white people, they're only speaking to each other.
Yes, there is an alarming rise in identity politics these days.
I mean, the truth is, Jonathan, there's no need for people to create these little segregated pockets within, what do they call them? Safe spaces.
Yeah, I haven't really got my head around the idea. I mean, if the university isn't a safe space, what is?
Our universities, Jonathan, come from a long and proud history as spaces where academics and students can express themselves freely, challenge views, cultivate minds. I want these young white people to know that our doors are open to them. No need for all this hopelessness and despair. Because that is what happens, Jonathan, in these safe spaces. At best, this is what happens, if you know what I mean. We all know that these spaces become breeding grounds for other things.
Thank you, Ella. That's an important message. Now, Katie, I can see you're keen to speak. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about your journey. How did you become a writer?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say to Professor Savenzo that I don't agree. We don't feel welcome at universities. We feel silenced, like we have nothing to contribute. Universities and schools are melanated institutions. The entire time I was studying, no one told me the truth about our history, how our land was invaded, our ancestors killed off. Instead, we were taught that our country was discovered, that melanins saved us. All of my real education happened outside of school and uni, on social media.
Okay, thanks for that, Katie. To get back to the question, how did you become a writer?
Well, it's connected. As I was saying, I wasn't told about my history at school or uni. Then Bilal approached me, asked me if I was interested in publishing a book. The truth is, I'd never even really thought about it.
It can't hurt, I imagine, that you look the way you do, posing in those exotic clothes.
Are you slut-shaming me?
Far from it. I find it absolutely charming.
I realised I had something special with Katie. She was a ready-made package, so outspoken and brave. My favourite poem by her is called Nan's Juicy Roast Dinners.
I remember that one going viral. Now, let's continue this conversation, but for now, I want to turn to Nikki. Nikki, I was one of your biggest champions on the Looker Prize judging panel. Lady in the Attic is a remarkable state-of-the-nation novel. You've always been quite aware of this underrepresentation issue, haven't you? There have been white characters in every novel that you've written, but in this last one, at a time where there's so much noise about diversity, you decided to make one of your main characters white. Can you tell us about why you thought this was important?
To be honest with you, Jonathan, I didn't see it as doing diversity. I was simply writing a novel that reflects the world around me. And the world isn't just made up of melanated people, is it? Non-melanated people exist too, and we can't continue ignoring them. I've personally interacted with non-melanated people all my life, school, college, post office, even in my own house. Our nanny and our housekeepers were white, for instance. My mom tells me I used to follow them around with a pen in my hand, writing down whatever they said, capturing their unique dialects and intonations. The inclusion of Samantha, a white main character, wasn't just obvious, it was necessary.
Yeah, there has, however, been a bit of a Twitter backlash, hasn't there?
Oh, it's ridiculous.
Someone called Amanda Jones seems to be leading the campaign. Is it all right if I read out some of her tweets so people get an idea?
Of course, Jonathan. I mean, if we don't champion freedom of speech, then we're no better than them, are we?
So Amanda Jones says, Samantha spends the entire novel getting pissed, counting calories, knitting Christmas jumpers and doing VAT scams to raise money for a holiday in Ibiza. She panders to every white stereotype there is. There's hardly any representation of white people in the media as it is, and in the few that exist, there's always some reference to white-collar crime, as if there's something inherently criminal in us. Now, this kind of criticism seems to be calling for censorship, essentially. How did it feel to be attacked like that?
I won't lie, it's been hard. I was terrified at first. I even had to call the police at one point. They were so helpful and supportive. And luckily, my publisher, he stood by me, even though there were calls to ban the book. And my good friend, John Lee, another revered journalist, well, he wrote about the whole thing in The Custodian. But really, most of the time, I tried to ignore petty criticism. After all, this is literature. Is that so hard to understand? I'm a writer, not a sociologist.
And surely it can't be denied that these things happen.
Exactly. The truth is, Samantha's character wasn't even made up. Her story was inspired by a newspaper article. So with this story, I'm humanizing her, helping people understand her motivations, her intentions, while shining a light on important social issues. Look, I believe in freedom of speech for everyone, but at the same time, you can't...
It does seem like everyone has an opinion on everything nowadays. There's no kindness or civility.
It's deliberate troublemaking. The internet is full of angry mobs attacking people.
To be frank, I've been attacked too, quite a few times. What impact do you think this is having on writers?
Well, we start to live in fear, don't we? And as a society, we used to respect writers.
Can I just say?
What are your thoughts on this, George? How do you feel about freedom of speech being under threat due to some people's sensitivities or ignorance? Now, George, I believe you're on mute. I think you need to press the button.
Oh, sorry, apologies. Yes, I agree. And I think kindness and civility, they're key. They're so important. People these days make out that melanins are all bad, that they're somehow against us. And I think it's attention seeking, frankly. I mean, of course, I'm not saying there isn't any racism. Of course there is. But I find it's usually amongst the really ignorant or uneducated melanins. And in my experience, most melanin people just want to help. And if people do have prejudices, then as non-melanated people, we have a responsibility to teach them. We need to show them that we're actually not so different after all.
Exactly, to reach across the divide instead of trying to get books banned.
Is the book really banned, though? Did it not just win the Looker?
It was a hard-earned win that came from years of learning the craft. I didn't just put on a milkmaid dress and start writing about being the manifestation of my grandmother's dreams or whatever that you write.
What are you trying to say?
That an essential respect for literature is under threat today. Look, a writer's job is to reveal deeper truths, not to pander to political correctness. It's kind of fascism. And mark my words, Jonathan, this will be the death of literature.
The real censorship is when people aren't free to say that they don't like the way they're being represented. Let's face it, Nikki, you're a lot more powerful than Amanda Jones or unknowns on social media.
I don't know about that, but it seems like the keyboard warriors are calling all the shots these days.
Maybe you and your friend are just annoyed at the fact that you can't control what's written about you anymore by pulling a few strings at the custodian.
Now, Katie, that's not very kind.
Some of us have had enough of the negative representations, the stereotyping and cliches, and we've had enough of trying to explain how to do it better when it's our lives that are being appropriated. Why can't you just step aside and let us represent ourselves?
But wouldn't that be pandering to identity politics, giving platforms to people who have little qualification, talent or skill apart from their race?
Are you actually saying that a melanin is better qualified than me to write about my life? Are you actually comparing me to somebody that's had all of the advantages? I mean, you were on the judging panel of a book, for fuck's sake, so we really have to ask, why on earth this is...
I'm not sure what happened there. It seems like we have a problem with Katie's audio. We'll sort that out straight away, but moving on. George, can you tell us a bit about your first novel?
Yeah, oh dear, technical difficulties. I started The Boy Who Couldn't Dance in my final year at Shoxford when I met a friend's mum at a party, Yomi Rodrigo. She's a publisher. She asked me what it was like growing up in a white family, if I had any stories to tell about my background, any struggles, the obstacles I'd gone through in my life. I told her, my life wasn't that interesting, but she wasn't having any of it. She convinced me that a person like me actually, has a lot to say, and she understood what it was like being brought up by parents who fed me a diet of bland food, who didn't let me mix with the wider world, and who never understood the importance of great literature.
So is the book autobiographical?
Not exactly. So The Boy Who Couldn't Dance is about Bob. He's a boy who fumbles his way through life. He goes through beer and dating, fish and chips, money. And then one day he sees that there's more out there, more to life. On the radio, he hears an old Beyonce song, and suddenly he finds his hips start to sway, his shoulders are going. This bit did actually happen to me. To the absolute horror of his parents, he decides to become a professional dancer, and that's what he ends up doing. My hope with the book is that it will inspire young people growing up in suffocating environments, just so they can see there's more out there, encourage them to go out and be free.
I learned so much from reading the book about communities that we don't always have access to. It felt almost like going on a trip abroad.
Can I ask a question, please?
Happy to have you back, Katie. Yeah, but if you could just wait for your turn, please.
Yeah, okay. By the way, George, these jives you're making at beer, fish and chips, white girls, Ed Sheeran, etc. What exactly is wrong with all of those things?
Katie, no, I think you're misunderstanding me. I don't have anything against traditional cultures.
Are you sure about that?
Katie. I mean, listen, I've paid my dues. Last week, I was in schools with young melanated children. We were exploring traditional white dress. We had the kids wearing flat caps, cardigans, socks and sandals. all of the good stuff.
In sandals, spiffing.
Yeah. So I do my bit for the white community. Okay, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge the deep problems that exist in our communities too. Ghettoization, extremism, illiteracy, and ignorance. And I believe we can tackle these and appreciate the culture at the same time. You understand, I think, Jonathan, don't you?
100%, 100%. Everyone loves a cheeky jacket potato on a Friday night, don't they? Sometimes they even tell them to leave the salt out. You've probably noticed how many more beach writers there are now compared to when you were starting out. What do you think of this new wave, a new generation of emerging beach writers?
Well, to be honest, it can be frustrating sometimes being lumped together as if we're all the same. The truth is, I'm much more than just a beach.
Yeah, of course you are.
Excuse me?
You wouldn't want to be thought of as just a white writer, now would you?
Well, I don't mean it like that. I'm not a white writer. I'm just a writer. I'd much rather be compared to Dahlia Yusuf or Dylan Kingston or Ngugi Kiuna.
Who just happen to be melanins.
Well, they're successful writers who I really admire.
Yes, and in the end, we're all just human, aren't we?
George,
Yeah.
Dahlia Yusuf and Dylan Kingston happen to be two of my closest friends.
Oh, wow, really?
I'll be sure to let them know how much you admire their work.
Oh, thank you, Nikki. Nikki, I really appreciate your support. It's great.
We hear you have a new book coming out, George.
Yeah. It's called Going Dutch. It's about a group of friends, and they're using this really out of date, archaic white tradition of splitting the bill at a restaurant, counting every penny, rather than adapting to modern times.
Going
That's
Dutch
what it's going for.
A beautiful practice. It represents the equality, freedom, and fairness at the heart of our culture. We have to stop carrying the shame.
I'm sorry, but celebrating everything that's white just because it's white is just another side of the same coin, isn't it?
Both important points. Beach writers have always been good at holding
By
on to
the way,
outdated traditions.
This term beach, I just want to say, it's really offensive. It's clearly a reference to our skin colour, like we're sand-coloured or washed out. Don't you think it's a little bit racist? And it doesn't even make sense. I mean, white people don't originally come from Australia and America, and habitants, well, that's clearly just been put there for sake of having a word beginning with A.
Thank you, Katie, for that opinion. Something to think about. But please do tweet about this event, Katie, if you haven't already. Now, moving on. I would be amiss if I didn't ask about the terrifying developments we're seeing in our world. The acts of terrorism, the violence, the drunkenness, debauchery being carried out in a widespread, some say covert and planned way across the UK and the world. How do you respond to these actions, George?
Jonathan, I wholeheartedly condemn them. These acts are not representative of us as a people.
Of course, but why aren't more white people speaking up and condemning this?
Well, many of us are. There are all kinds of initiatives being started by those of us who are peace-loving, those of us who are moderate. We want to reassure people. So, for example, there's the really worthy Dance with a White Person initiative, which I was actually a part of.
And why do you think that so many white people are following this path?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of brainwashing, a toxic mindset. I've seen it happen in my community to people I know, certainly. And as I show in my novels, this can actually happen really easily when you alienate yourself from the world around you.
Can I just say, George, we've introduced your first book into our curriculum at Oxford.
Gosh, really?
Yes.
It's great.
Yeah. We're also going to be introducing a new module on marginalised voices, and we've also introduced Sebastian Aubrey's first novel, Homeless.
Oh, great. That novel was a really big inspiration for me. Definitely. It's great.
Yeah. In fact, we are hoping to have Sebastian as our guest speaker at the inaugural lecture for the launch of the scholarship.
Oh, wow. We look forward to that, Ella. Now, unfortunately, we need to bring things to a close. I would love to invite the panel to share some closing comments before we open up to questions. Nikki, can we start with you?
All I want to say is that diversity is important, but let's not sacrifice literature for it. Let's not forget freedom of expression. Let's not forget that every society needs its thinkers and writers. We can't be like them, the racists, the fascists, the right-wingers, burning and banning books, canceling writers. We're the civilized ones. We talk, we discuss, we write our own books.
That's just magnificent. You are an inspiration to us all. Beauty and brains. The perfect
That's
woman.
so creepy. I'm sorry, but you would not say that to a man. Men like you should not be given a panel. I mean...
We seem to have lost Katie. Anyway, thank you, Nikki. Ella, do you have any closing comments?
Can I just say, it's always fun doing events with writers. Much more interesting than academics. No, I would just like to say, if you or anyone would like to take part in the Writing Back Scholarship, then do get in touch with my secretary. You'll find our details on the website.
Bilal?
I would just urge everyone to support minority voices wherever you can. It's the least we can do. Send them any suitable opportunities. Help a non-melanated person to write an application. Find a publisher. Support them financially. Ask them their story. Don't believe the news coverage. We all have to change the narrative together.
Amen to that.
Amen.
Amen. I mean.
And George?
Just thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. It's a real honor to be here. I'm very grateful for the invitation. Well, I'll just take the opportunity for some shameless self-promotion, if that's okay. Going Dutch will be released next week. You can buy advanced copies. Like Bilal said, just please do your bit to support diversity.
Thank you, George. Now, sadly, we seem to have lost Katie, technical difficulties. We have some time to open to the audience now. Does anyone have any questions? If you just flag up that you have a question in the chat, and I'll ask you to unmute yourselves and put on your video. One has just come through from Malia. Go ahead, Malia.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for that super interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. George and Nikki, I am a big fan. George, that scene in your novel when Bob is he's let go of all of his stuff and he's on that stage dancing, it really moved me. It made me cry.
Oh, amazing.
And
thank you.
Nikki, my question is actually for Nikki. I wanted to ask you, in this very male-dominated industry, how do you, as a woman, kind of hold on to your strength and self-belief?
I think what the questioner is trying to ask is if you have any thoughts, Nikki, on the difficulties of writing as a woman. You've always seemed so competent and focused, more than any man that I know.
Well, thanks for that question. Of course, I strongly believe that women should be pushing past all the barriers and boundaries. But I've never personally experienced that kind of self-doubts before. Maybe because I have such a supportive and encouraging father. The only thing that I would say that has been troubling is how often I'm accused of using my looks to get ahead. That just infuriates me.
Your mind is what I find delightful, in all honesty, Nikki.
Well, I think as a woman, we shouldn't give into this idea that we have it any more difficult than men. If we buy into that belief, well, that's what will manifest. In reality, if your work is good, you'll have the same opportunities as any man, if not more, quite frankly.
Thanks, Nikki, for that bold response. Any more questions? There's a lot of questions coming through for Katie, but I'm afraid she's no longer with us. Anyone else?
There seems to be someone, Tom, who's trying to ask a question.
Yes. All right. Do you want to introduce yourself, Tom? Tom, as many of us know, is the founder of Critical Voices and has been publishing and writing for some time now.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Bilal, actually. You direct and publish White Voices at Cup of Tea, yeah? But do you employ any white people to publish, to edit or direct? Because as far as I know, your team is completely melanated.
Yes, it's a good point. We did have an intern earlier this year, but it's not easy to find people with the interest and that level of skill and experience. It will take time.
If you employed a white person, then they might have told you that in your authentic play, the characters, dialogue, home setting, and even the names sound made up. I mean, Tooney.
We now have a native dramaturg working on the play to iron out some of the inconsistencies. Of course, everything in the play is true coming out of our research, but we had to change some of the superficial things to make it work as a play.
And it really did work. I can attest to that. Now, any more questions? Yes, Unkita.
Hi. Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it. My question is, with all the interest in diversity these days, with it being trendy and all, do you think that some melanins might start feeling like their stories are not interesting or valuable? Like, I'm a melanated writer, and I definitely feel like there's been a decrease in opportunities ever since diversity became so popular.
Thank you. Now, that's a good question. What do you think, Nikki?
It's a valid concern, to be honest with you. I mean, no offense to Daft, but sometimes I do feel that these diversity schemes have gone too far. I mean, frankly, it seems like if a blonde, blue-eyed person walks into Paris Press these days, well, they get a book deal straight away. No questions asked. But I would say, and Kita, was it? Keep trying, keep writing. And like you said, it's worth remembering that this might be just a trend. Real literature, it's more enduring.
Does anyone want to add to that?
Well, I disagree, obviously. I think the whole problem is that there are only spaces for melanin voices. And with this work, we're trying to correct an imbalance. That's why our doors are always open to beaches with something to say. Just the other day, I told my Uber driver that I'd love to tell his story, and he was more than eager.
Fascinating. Any more questions? Anyone else? It would be good to get someone different. Okay, yes, Tom. Just to clarify, we're looking for questions, not comments, not opinions or personal experiences, and please don't be offended if I cut you off. It's for the purposes of time and relevance. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, my question is for Ms. Savenzo.
Professor Savenzo, I'm sorry, but I get quite tired of people who struggle to accept the fact that I'm a professor. Worked quite hard to acquire this title.
I'm sorry, Professor Savenzo. You mentioned that you're putting Sebastian Aubrey's novel on your curriculum.
Homeless. Yes.
Yeah, you do realise that Sebastian Aubrey's an aristocrat, don't you?
Is he?
You can kind of tell from his name, can't you? But his parents own a golf course. He went to Sheaton and Shoxford. What does he know about being homeless?
Well, I don't think there's any need for us to be so reductive. I don't think it matters what the background of the writer is. I mean, your novel, George, Going Dutch, That's partially based in Holland, isn't it?
Kind of. It's really the name of the custom. The titles a play on that. If you see what I mean.
If we're only expected to write what we experience, then we wouldn't have a very interesting canon now, would we?
Exactly. Just because I'm not white doesn't mean I can't write about Caucasian people.
Yeah, no. My point was that Aubrey's novel is it's just offensive on every level. And it's ridiculous that mainstream publishers aren't interested when we write honestly about our own lives, but when someone like you, Nikki, when you write about us, about white people, then you're celebrated for doing it, and we're all supposed to be grateful. And you know, it's fine, right? It's fine if you want to write about white characters, but you need to work a bit harder. Do your research. I mean, newspaper articles. If you don't face your own prejudices, then of course they'll just be reproduced in your work.
I'm sorry, but I didn't come here today to be attacked. Okay, first that girl, and it's like no matter what you do, it's never enough. If you don't write about white characters, well, they criticize you, and if you do write about them, well, they still criticize you. In fact, the more successful you get, the more people try to bring you down. And sometimes it's just too much.
Look, I wasn't trying to say that you shouldn't write.
They think just because I'm melanin, just because someone that looks like me might have been involved in the oppression of someone that looks like them, that I should pay for. Gosh, that's so unfair.
No, I was only talking about the right-wing newspaper article you based your white character on.
Are you saying that I'm a racist after all that I've done?
No, of course not. Look, I'm sorry. I'm not attacking you. It's just that if you're putting books into the public space, making a career, making money, then you can't expect that no one will call you out on it.
Melanins have feelings too, you know?
Okay, I'm sorry, that really is enough. I mean, how accommodating can one be? Are you okay, darling? Do you need us to take a little break?
Oh, I'm fine, Jonathan. Thank you. Don't worry about me.
All right. Now, are there any more questions before we wrap up?
Can I just say, Tom, I find your point of view compelling, an urgent intrusion. I really value what you have to say and the way you say it. We would love to showcase your voice at our company.
Frankly, Bilal, I'm not looking to be commodified into a product like George or Katie. And it's interesting, isn't it, that she's disappeared off of here, isn't it? Eh?
Oh, right. Thank you for that. Moving on. Any more questions before we run out of time?
Sorry, Jonathan, can I just respond to Tom there?
All right.
Thank you. So I've known Tom for a while. You know, as it happens, Tom published my first short story. God, I think I was barely 20 at the time. Look, regarding this remark about me being commodified or whatever it was. So, okay, it's not the first time I've heard this, I have to say. And mate, you have to understand, you're not doing yourself any favors by being so emotional. And then always complaining that things are bad, that we're shut out. You have to, you know, roll up your sleeves. You've got to get involved. You've got to adapt. You can't wait until things are perfect first. I'm not stupid, and I'm not a sellout. I mean, do you know how hard I've had to work to get where I am today?
Where are you?
Well, I mean, I'm on this panel for a start.
Well, as if that's some kind of achievement.
Well, of course it is. Of course it's an honor. Look, I'm out here. I've had some success, and people care about what I have to say. That means something. Okay, you can't tell me that it doesn't. And okay, yeah, sometimes I, you know, put a certain spin on things. You know, audiences like hearing about drunkenness and poor dancing skills. But but those are real problems too. I didn't make them up. I actually was a bad dancer before I met melanins. But that's not the point. Look, we've got to survive. We have to thrive, ideally. And if you'd seen my mum's face the day I was on Oprah, and I don't know, maybe that's why I write. And it's really tough when you feel your own people turning against you. Really
Thank
hard.
you, George. Thank you. Surely you'd agree, though, there is no your own people. We are all one, after all.
Yeah, of course.
It seems we've now lost Tom as well. Must be due to the patchy internet in the areas where Katie and Tom live. But no matter. I actually think this might be a good time to wrap up. We'll post some details down below, and do follow, like, subscribe, etc. if you'd like to do your bit for diversity. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you once more to our panel. Now, this conversation is the last event in our calendar to mark White History Month. We hope to see you all next year when we do it all again. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.